of a seat in Washington, D.C. Marie, welcome to Pax Christi, Texas.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you all. It's really nice to be with you. I was delighted that Danny asked me if I would join him tonight to say a few words about the moral and pastoral dimensions of nuclear disarmament from a Catholic perspective. I'm really delighted. I suspect that what I have to say will not be new for any of you, but perhaps it will just give us a little bit of context as we prepare for Danny. So first, a bit of familiar history. In Pachamenteris, 1963, which was written, if you remember, shortly after Gandhi's witness to the power of nonviolence, in that document, Pope John the 23rd clearly rejected military force and the so-called peace methodology of nuclear deterrence because it betrayed that what he called the natural unity of the human family whose only real basis for peace can be love and the collaboration that goes with us. A few years later, during the Second Vatican Council, an intense debate took place on war and peace, and in particular on the indiscriminate nature of nuclear weapons and on whether deterrence was morally legitimate. In the final document, which you remember, Gaudium et Spes, the Council clearly condemned total war, supported the legal right of conscientious objection, affirmed the primacy of conscience in every act of war, and praised nonviolent resistance for the vindication of rights. At the same time, it did maintain a government's right to possess nuclear weapons, but only as a deterrent. In 1983, some years later, after a long process that actually did involve Pax Christi, the U.S. bishops in the Challenge of Peace said that nuclear deterrence was morally acceptable, but strictly conditioned on progress toward nuclear disarmament. Familiar. 10 years later, in 1993, the U.S. bishops who were at that point very aware of the striking success of nonviolent struggles against repression, for example, in the Philippines, in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union. It was just after the end of the Cold War. In their pastoral letter, The Harvest of Justice, they said, quote, nonviolence consists of a commitment to resist manifest injustice and public evil with means other than force. These include dialogue, negotiations, protests, strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, and civil resistance. National leaders, they said, bear a moral obligation to see that nonviolent alternatives are seriously considered for dealing with conflicts. Maybe, they thought, there actually is another route to peace, an alternative to armed force, especially an alternative to nuclear weapons for achieving national security. A few years later, in 1998, on the 15th anniversary of the Challenge of Peace, in a letter that was actually organized by Pax Christi USA, 75 U.S. bishops, imagine that, 75 U.S. bishops. I think at that point there were maybe 120 or 130 U.S. bishops who were members of Pax Christi USA. But 75 U.S. bishops published a statement that condemned the policy of nuclear deterrence. They said, quote, nuclear weapons are incompatible with the peace we seek for the 21st century. They cannot be justified. They deserve condemnation. This is a moral challenge, a legal challenge, and a political challenge. That multi-based challenge must be met by the application of our humanity, they said. After many years of working to change the church's strictly conditioned acceptance of nuclear deterrence, we actually began to see a glimmer of hope in December of 2014, when during the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons, the Holy See shifted from a strictly conditioned moral acceptance of nuclear deterrence toward the outright condemnation of nuclear weapons in its important statement that was called Nuclear Disarmament, a Time for Abolition. That statement didn't get a lot of notice, but it was an enormous step forward on the part of the Vatican. In the following years, as you may remember, the Holy See was very active in the negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, or the Nuclear Ban Treaty, and was among the very first states to sign and ratify the treaty. I think there are currently 74 state parties to the treaty and another 23, 25 signatories. Right after that, right after the TPNW was out for signatures, during a private audience with those of us who were participating in a Vatican symposium on nuclear disarmament in November 2017, Pope Francis definitively condemned the, quote, very possession of nuclear weapons, moving the Catholic commitment to nuclear abolition beyond any limited acceptance of deterrence to a complete moral rejection. I remember as we left the papal audience that day, people were actually checking with each other to see if they had heard what he said accurately. It was quite a surprise. An immediate challenge that followed from the church's absolute rejection of the possession of nuclear weapons was that of exploring the pastoral implications of the church's position and the responsibility of moral theologians to generate the level of discernment and moral guidance necessary for policymakers, military personnel, scientists, investors, and ordinary citizens to chart an ethical course for professional and personal life choices in the wake of the Nuclear Ban Treaty and the church's prohibition. I remember in particular talking with now Cardinal McElroy, who was then Bishop McElroy from San Diego, right after the audience, and that was his first question: was what are the pastoral consequences of this abolition? Surely, much more investment is needed by the church to educate and activate Catholics at a parish and local community level, to promote the abolition of nuclear weapons, to divest from corporations manufacturing nuclear weapons and their delivery systems, to do business only with banks that are not involved in financing nuclear weapons production, and to share information about conscientious objection and selective conscientious objection. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, for over 80 years now, the church has been leaning toward a global ethic capable of dealing with the human capacity for utter destruction of life on this planet. That global ethic is nonviolence, and we are closer to embracing it now than we ever have been. We humans are tired of violence. We cannot sustain the current levels of violent conflict, systemic violence, and war that have such unconscionable consequences. We simply have to find a better way to live together on this small planet, and I think we're beginning to understand that. One of the great gifts of our age is the growing recognition of active nonviolence as a positive and powerful force for social change. Nonviolence is an essential characteristic of the world we want to live in, and it is the only way to get there. We know well that everything is connected. Pope Francis certainly said that often enough. And we know that security will be realized for everyone or for no one, and that nuclear deterrence is a deceitful strategy that offers a false illusion of security. It is time to replace the logic of violence in which we are mired with a new logic of nonviolence. For that to happen, the Catholic Church needs to articulate a new moral framework for its teaching on violence and war. Pope Leo has been increasingly moving in that direction. There is no such thing as a just war. The realization of a new paradigm based on nonviolence is even more necessary now than it was a few months ago, and I actually think more possible, in spite of the visibility given to the just war tradition in the past few weeks. The current public discussion about war, especially the war in Iran, is generating deeper reflection on the consequences of centering nonviolence in Catholic teaching and practice, and of articulating this new ethical framework. What matters now, according to Cardinal McElroy, is to institutionalize active nonviolence, to show how it's effective, and to build institutions in society that operate from that stance. Nowhere is this transformation more desperately needed than in freeing the world from what Jesuit Dick McSorley so many years ago called the taproot of evil in our society, the terrifying threat of nuclear weapons. The Catholic conscience has begun to think about war and peace in terms of not just war, but in terms of gospel nonviolence. The Christian no to modern war can be logically based on the just war tradition, but for that no of conscience to garner the strength to transform human hearts, it must be derived from and constantly renewed in the yes of the gospel. Then, as theologian Jim Douglas so many years ago said, conscience will not only purged of the nuclear sword, but reformed in the strength of the nonviolent cross. Thank you.
Oh,
Unmute,
Arthur,
Arthur.
I think you're muted.
Thank you. That helps. Danny Hall leads Back from the Brink, congressional advocacy, and faith community outreach, advancing nuclear disarmament and common sense risk reduction through strategic lobbying, coalition building, and public engagement. Danny organized Back from the Brink's 2025 Capitol Hill Lobby Day, reaching 125 congressional offices, 2026 Lobby Day reaching 140 congressional offices, and co-founded No Faith in Nukes, a Washington-based interfaith coalition strengthening alignment between Beltway advocacy and grassroots organizations. He curates the coalition's blog series, Faith in Action, Moral Courage for a Nuclear-Free Future, and regularly provides political analysis, messaging guidance, and expert commentary on developments in the nuclear security landscape. We look very much forward to your message, Danny. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for your kind words, Arthur. And thank you so much to everyone who's gathered here today. It's a joy to be with you. Again, I'm Danny Hall. I'm the lead Capitol Hill representative and Faith Community Outreach Coordinator for Back from the Brink. And I am very grateful to follow that powerful reflection we just heard on the Catholic moral perspective from Marie Dennis. So rather than repeat the moral case for abolition that was articulated so beautifully, I want to try to build on it, and I want to begin with a moment that has stayed with me. A few weeks ago, I was in the Longworth House office building cafeteria with volunteers from across our movement, Quakers, Methodists, Pax Christi folks, a Catholic deacon, Unitarians, the Church of the Brethren, and Physicians for Social Responsibility. We were stuffing packets for a congressional letter drop, 140 letters, from more than 250 mayors, council members, and county officials urging Congress to support the Back from the Brink resolutions. It was early in the morning. People were drinking coffee and they were chatting and settling into the day. And then an alert flashed across every television. A whole civilization will die tonight. A presidential warning. A phrase that carries nuclear implications. The room didn't go silent, but it shifted. People froze in mid-sentence, eyes lifted toward the screens. There was this collective, instinctive pause, the kind of pause where everyone is thinking the same thing, but no one says it out loud. And beneath that pause was a deeper recognition. Under current US policy, one person has sole authority to order nuclear use. One person, no vote, no second opinion. And in that moment, the system wasn't malfunctioning, it was exposed. And yet, despite that atmosphere, or maybe because of it, we stayed focused. We split into teams, we walked the halls, and we delivered every letter. Because this is what nuclear policy looks like when it becomes human. Not a chessboard, not an abstraction, but people taking responsibility for the world their children will inherit. That brings me to the message that unites Back from the Brink, Pax Christi USA, and our national coalition, a message Catholics, scientists, health professionals, and local leaders can all use. Nuclear weapons are a failing system that cannot manage today's risks. The United States must actively pursue a world free of nuclear weapons as a national security imperative and take practical steps now to reduce risk and actively build the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons through U.S. leadership. This message does two things at once. It names the long-term goal, a world free of nuclear weapons, and it names the near-term pathway, practical steps that reduce risk now and actively build the conditions for elimination. And let me say this clearly. We are not talking about stabilizing deterrence. We're not talking about incrementalism. We are talking about building the conditions for elimination, not waiting for them, through deliberate U.S. leadership. Risk reduction steps are not the destination. They are the scaffolding, the beams of a new security architecture. Let me name very briefly why this moment matters so much. First, crises now unfold across multiple regions in minutes, not months. We're living in a world of cascades, overlapping, fast-moving confrontations that compress decision time in ways the old nuclear system was never designed to handle. Second, decision time has collapsed. Missile flight times are measured in minutes. Cyber interference can distort early warning systems. Artificial intelligence can accelerate decisions faster than human judgment can keep up. Third, the guardrails that once slowed crises down have eroded. For the first time in more than 50 years, the United States and Russia have no binding limits on their strategic arsenals and no verification mechanisms in place. And here's the deeper truth. What we're seeing now isn't malfunction. Again, it's exposure. The nuclear system is behaving exactly as a brittle system behaves when its buffers erode. And even when those buffers existed, the system was still never stable. The nuclear system nearly failed under the most favorable conditions it will ever see. Long decision times, shared norms, declining arsenals. If it almost failed then, it cannot survive today's faster, more entangled world. That is why naming elimination now matters. The system cannot be made safe as it currently exists. We need a new architecture, and that begins with Congress. Back from the Brink offers, as a national grassroots campaign, a focus on reducing nuclear risks and building the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons. We offer three things. One, a unified message, a message that connects moral clarity with strategic realism. A practical policy framework, concrete steps Congress can take right now, including House Resolution 317 in the House and Senate Resolution 323 in the Senate. These resolutions call on the United States to actively pursue a world free of nuclear weapons and to challenge the logic of deterrence that keeps us locked in a failing system. And three, an advocacy infrastructure you can plug into immediately. We help you prepare for congressional meetings, coordinate district level pressure, build parish and diocesan engagement, and connect with a national network of partners. You don't have to reinvent anything. You just have to step into the work. And why is Texas so strategically essential? Texas is one of the most important states in the country for faith-based nuclear risk advocacy. 8.5 million Catholics, More than 1,000 parishes, communities that are urban and rural, immigrant and military, border and university. This is one of the most powerful Catholic ecosystems in the country. And when we look at the congressional map, we see something else. Texas has multiple high leverage districts where Catholic voices can make a real difference. Texas is not a side player. Texas is a strategic center of gravity. The stabilizing assumptions of the post-Cold War era, predictable adversaries, long decision timelines, reliable communication channels have collapsed. In this environment, risk reduction steps only make sense as part of a pathway toward a world free of nuclear weapons. If we don't name elimination as the end state, these steps can be misinterpreted as a return to incremental arms control or an effort to simply stabilize deterrence. The resolutions avoid that by stating clearly that the United States should actively pursue a world free of nuclear weapons and take practical steps now to build the conditions for eliminations. That is not idealism, that is strategic realism. The resolutions begin by naming something almost never said plainly in Washington. Nuclear risk has never been manageable. Again, even in the most stable periods, we avoided catastrophe more by luck than design. And today's environment makes that luck even thinner. These resolutions do something rare. They connect immediate steps that reduce risk today with a long-term strategic goal, a world free of nuclear weapons. They make the logic explicit. Reduce nuclear risk now. Rebuild guardrails, stabilize crises, and name elimination as the only stable end state. And here's the deeper insight. Conditions are not discovered, they are constructed. And these resolutions help build the democratic legitimacy any long-term security architecture requires. Let me go over the four-stage model of effective advocacy that Back from the Brink often refers to. It's a model that mirrors how social movements actually shift political behavior. Stage one is formation. People need grounding, moral, ecological, and strategic. And I think this is where Pax Christi really shines. Stage two is mobilization. Formation becomes power when communities act together. Stage three is policy engagement. We translate moral conviction into concrete asks. Co-sponsor House Resolution 317, Senate Resolution 323. Challenge deterrence. Support steps that build the conditions for elimination. And stage four, coalition integration. No movements succeed alone. And here's the essential truth. Institutions can operate within the system, but they cannot redesign it. They are not built to generate political will. That's why grassroots leadership isn't just helpful, it's essential. So formation, mobilization, engagement, and integration. This is how movements shift congressional behavior. And here are what I think are some of the most effective actions Pax Christi, Texas could take right now in the next few months. Parish-based education and formation, host sessions on nuclear risk, creation care, and the climate impacts of nuclear famine and nuclear winter. District office meetings. This is, I think, the single most effective action. A small group of constituents meeting with a congressional staffer can have real impact. Clergy engagement. A letter from a pastor or bishop can open doors that no policy memo ever could by speaking to the moral dimension of this issue. Mobilizing high leverage districts. If you live in or have connections to Texas Congressional District 15, 16, 20, 21, 28, 29, or 34, your voice is especially powerful. And building a statewide network. These quarterly forums could become spaces for a formation pipeline, a mobilization hub, and district level pressure generation, and a co-sponsorship engine. This is how we build sustained power. So in closing, let me just say again, thank you for your leadership. your courage, your willingness to step into this work. Pax Christi, Texas has the moral voice. Back from the Brink has the strategic architecture. And together, we can build the grassroots power needed to shift congressional norms, reduce nuclear risk, and move our country toward a world free of nuclear weapons. I'm very grateful to walk with you in this work, and with the rest of our time together, happy to answer any questions that you might have. And with that, I'll hand things back over to Arthur. Arthur, I think you might still be muted.
There we go again. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'd like to hear from Cooper Christiansen and what's happening with the nuclear organization in Austin. And yeah, there. Thank you, Cooper. Cooper was one of our previous presenters at one of our forums, and he's with the Rappaport Center at the University of Texas in Austin.
Can you hear me? Everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, thank you so much, Arthur, for the invitation to come see this forum. And Danny, it was wonderful to get to hear your talk. We worked together quite a bit through the Texans Ending Nuclear Dangers, which is Back from the Brink statewide hub here in Texas. So if you're interested in understanding and engaging a bit more with other groups doing this nuclear disarmament work and advancing Back from the Brink's work across Texas, you're welcome to join our monthly meetings and become an affiliate of the Texans Ending Nuclear Dangers umbrella group, which means that we'll actively connect you with other folks in your area working on this issue and help be a liaison between you and Danny and the other folks across the country working with Back from the Brink. So I'll put my email in the chat if you're interested in engaging either your local Pax Christi chapter or other groups you're part of in the work of Texans Ending Nuclear Dangers.
Thank you. So now we will open up our conversation. Who would like to ask a question or share some information? Keep in mind, you might be like me, you might be muted. So I would like to say something. When you talk, Danny, I really what's coming across to my mind is the messaging. What are the messages and the trail of messages? It's almost like teaching something that's very complex. Where do we begin? And how do we have this flow and where do we send it? You might take a look around the room. There's a few younger people, but mostly older people in Texas. Some of whom are in this room are in their 80s. And so, I mean, talk about courageous and heroic. But it's still with it, still with it. But could you address that too? Because that's what I'm hearing in what you're saying. But Linda has a question. She raised her hand. Go ahead, Linda.
Thanks, Arthur. I was just wondering if there was any talk around the country about proposing a U.S. amendment about the use of nuclear weapons, even limiting war. I think that we've seen since the start of the year that our Congress has been very ineffective at upholding the Constitution that clearly says they are to declare war, but that's a whole war powers issue. But by proposing an amendment, it at least gets a lot of people talking. And sometimes it gets politicians to start doing the work they're supposed to. So I was wondering if there was any word about that.
I mean, yeah, there are various bills in the current Congress that address different aspects of the nuclear risk landscape. There is a bill that addresses no first use, reforming no first use, so that there are checks on sole presidential authority to launch nuclear weapons. There is a bill in Congress that addresses the danger and the risk of resumption of explosive nuclear weapons testing and to prevent funding from any activities that would be geared towards the resumption of explosive nuclear testing at the Nevada Proving Grounds. The challenges are can be focused in those particular areas, but I think we're really faced with a challenging political environment. Congress today is so deeply polarized that even the most basic common sense resolutions on arms control, something that has been has enjoyed the benefit of bipartisan support for decades, is a completely partisan issue now. There is a resolution that was introduced by Representative Bill Foster, simply talking about the danger of the expiration of the New START Treaty, the last treaty between the United States and Russia that expired on February 5th, and reaffirming the value of arms control. To this date, there are zero Republicans that have co-sponsored that resolution. So Republicans are not supporting arms control, let alone disarmament. And that's why with the Back from the Brink resolution, for example, HRES 317, SRES 323, we're not necessarily trying to target Republicans right now, or we're focusing on progressive and moderate Democrats and striving to build a critical mass in Congress that grows and normalizes the call for elimination. This resolution was introduced in the last Congress and it gained 45 co-sponsors. When it was introduced in the current Congress, it exceeded that number in the first half of the session, when it is at 57 supporters now. My goal is that we will get to somewhere between 80 and 100 before the end of this session. And then when it gets reintroduced next year or in the next session, can start to work with some of our moderate Democratic supporters to reach across the aisle and start having some of these conversations with moderate Republicans as well. I think that's the only way that you can start to normalize this conversation in committees of relevance like Armed Services and Foreign Affairs. In those committees right now, the most progressive voices are not calling for nuclear abolition or a new security architecture with the elimination of nuclear weapons. The most progressive voices in those spaces will talk about risk reduction, we'll talk about stabilization. That's the most progressive end. But it's still very firmly rooted in a Cold War logic of nuclear deterrence and not challenging that doctrine, but trying to work within it and find solutions. If we want to normalize the call for elimination so it can enter those spaces, we need to widen the Overton window, or what it's also understood as the range of what's politically imaginable or viewed as politically serious and possible. And we do that by growing the number of congressional supporters in Congress and building a strong grassroots movement outside of Congress to support that shift in thinking. I think this model has been used effectively, starting with progressives and then widening it out with the climate crisis. That used to be an issue that was unspeakable in Congress. Nobody would do anything to challenge the fossil fuel industry until it changed. 5%, 10%, 15% members of Congress then started talking about it regularly. A grassroots movement grew to support it, and we saw that shift take place. Similarly with the issue of marriage equality, that used to be an unspeakable issue in the halls of Congress until it wasn't. And that's because a small number, 5, 10, 50% of members of Congress started talking about it. Grassroots movements grew to support it, and it became normalized in the committees of relevance. I believe we can do the same thing with nuclear abolition as a way to create the ecosystem for members of Congress to be able to introduce it in a way that's politically safe to do so. But we need to build the political support structure in order for that to happen. But I hope that answers your question.
Karen Ball has her hand up.
Well, Danny asked if what he said answered someone's question. So I want to, before I ask my question, make sure they were satisfied with his answer.
Yeah, Linda answered the question. Yes, she's saying yes.
Okay. All right. I didn't see her. My question is, where does a conversation about economics fit into this? So at the beginning, Marie You talked about a challenge, a legal, political, and a moral challenge. There was no mention of economics. And if we go back to beyond Vietnam, we know that a nation that spends more money on militarization than anything else is approaching spiritual death. I would say we're already there, spiritually dying. Okay. So maybe not focusing on the moral issue, but looking at the economic issue of how much is this really costing us to do this. Also, I'm tied to, I'm going to weave in a couple of things that might seem like they're disconnected, but they really do connect. So on that economic one is also looking at the doctrine of discovery, because we in the United States have an architecture built on domination, and it has an economic base of being able to grab land. So while the previous Pope, repudiated, there was no effort to dismantle the doctrine of discovery. And is this something that, as Catholics, we might be able to be making the case for? Because again, it has an economic basis to it and a morality to it. And then, Danny, the other thread I want to pull in is you talked about the human impact of nuclear weapons, and how the room changed when you heard the egregious things that came out of, our leaders. And I use that term leader um, loosely, in regards to annihilating a total population. But another thread that connects to the economics is AI. Okay. So right now there's a major push in letting AI go crazy. Okay. And one of the things that has kept us from complete nuclear annihilation is the human factor that has been able to stop a chain of command and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe I should not, call my leader and say, oh, I think an incoming missile's coming, and has saved us. But with the economic push to expand AI, and we already know the first target in the Iran war was a school, okay? And it most likely was an AI chosen target. So again, how, those connections, and so I guess my question is, shouldn't we also kind of add the element of economics into this discussion when we are talking about nuclear weapons?
I'd love to have Marie speak first and offer her thoughts.
Well, just a few thoughts. Absolutely, I totally agree with you. I think that at the base of our love affair with violence of all kinds, including the nuclear weapons, there's a very deep economic base to it. I think the profit in just at that, it's deeper than just profit, but the profit in weapons production and marketing and on and on and on is tremendous, and a constant driver for more investment in more wars and so on and so forth. So I totally agree. I also do believe that sort of one of the reasons why my focus has been for the last decade or so on trying to understand what would happen if the church actually centered nonviolence in its teaching. And I believe that it would have to deal with all of the expressions of violence, of which there are so many. They're political, they're certainly economic, they're social, they're religious, and so on. The church would also have to deal with the internal expressions of violence that have been pretty overwhelming for decades, probably hundreds of years. So power over relationships within the church, the exclusion of women from full participation in the church, the sex abuse scandal, and so on. The church would have to deal with that. And I believe that would have to look at all of the ways in the last 2,000 years that the church has contributed to extreme violence in a particular context in a particular period of time, much of which continues to be feeding sort of our way of being until now. So absolutely, I agree with what you said, and I think that my belief is that a real shift to a paradigm of nonviolence would move us in a direction of the kinds of deep systemic and structural changes that need to be made.
Danny had said previously that the church was a moral, did you say moral compass? Yeah, go ahead.
Was that a question for me?
Yeah. I
Oh,
think you said that the contribution of the church and our program this evening, the role of the church, that topic, that the church offered the moral guidance in this
absolutely.
conversation.
Absolutely. I think without, as Marie was saying, a systemic cultural shift towards nonviolence, it's difficult to build the broad political base necessary to shift military thinking and shift our thinking about nuclear weapons, about a system that's built on the assumption that it's okay to threaten the mass genocide of people that we target as enemies with weapons that can erase cities overnight and potentially end human civilization by accident. There's a strong moral case to be made against reliance on nuclear weapons, against not only threatening to use them, but possessing nuclear weapons. And I think the moral case ties into the economic part completely. I think it's important to look at the US federal budget as a moral document. It tells us what we value and what we don't value. We're the budget that is planning to spend 1.5 trillion dollars on military in the next year. It's planning to spend over $2 trillion dollars in modernizing the nuclear triad over the next few decades, is the same budget that is taking away Medicaid and is taking away food assistance and is funding ICE raids. So we're told that we need nuclear weapons to keep us safe, while at the same time, we're using our budgets in a way where we're left hungry, uninsured, and afraid that we're going to be raided or our neighbors are going to be raided by the federal government. So it's important to, I think, highlight the hypocrisy when we talk about nuclear weapons as necessary for our safety and security, when there are so many elements of our domestic life that are being neglected or actively undermined that make us less safe and less secure on a daily basis. And I would also say about the artificial intelligence piece, you're absolutely right that that needs to be a very important part of building a new security architecture where elimination is viewed not as aspirational but essential for long-term stability. The nuclear risk environment today is not the nuclear risk environment of the Cold War. It is very different, and artificial intelligence is one significant structural change that has occurred that makes that true. It dramatically reduces decision-making windows, making reliance on information that might be fabricated or hallucinated or incorrect much more likely. And it makes the risk of miscalculation and error that much higher. So the risk of escalation has always been there, but that risk starts now higher on the escalation ladder, and it rises faster. So the risk of spiking above the nuclear threshold at any given moment is higher now than it's ever been in the history of nuclear weapons, because the system has never been stressed by the destabilizing factors that now stress it, and it's never had the loss of buffers that existed during the post-Cold War period that we're experiencing the loss of now. So we need a new security architecture that reflects the new destabilizers of the moment and that recognize that there's no place for nuclear weapons in a system where that strives to achieve stability. It's a catastrophic failure mode that cannot be mitigated in the current environment. Strategically, it's in our interest to create a system that's no longer reliant on a weapon system that holds the potential for such catastrophic failure. That's a conversation I often have with folks in working on Capitol Hill because they speak within the framework of nuclear deterrence. So I'm trying to approach it from a system safety standpoint, where I explain to them that the system is not safe. It needs to be reformed. And just like other system safety approaches, nuclear weapons need to be treated the same way. And it's a way to try to speak in code that they are better understanding. But in order for even those ideas to hold weight in those spaces, we need a broad and powerful morally rooted grassroots movement across the country supporting those ideas. And that kind of foundation doesn't need to be rooted in the technicalities of nuclear architecture. It can be just plainly and powerfully rooted in our values and our moral commitments to how we think we should relate to each other as human beings. And that's going to create a very important part of the ecosystem that supports this long-term shift by policymakers in Washington, D.C., which is why, communities like Pax Christi are so powerful and so important. So I'll stop there.
We have two hands up. We have Joe Marcinkowski.
Yes, in all my time on Earth and active in an anti-nuclear pro-peace program, I've never seen us so close to disaster as we are now. And specifically, Israel might be the deliverer, or our president would deliver it, because they've reached a point now where they can't continue the monstrous acts they've been going through with the genocide. They're losing in Lebanon. Hezbollah is pushing them out. Iran did a real job on the Israeli military structure in their country. Almost 1.5 million Israeli settlers and citizens have left the country. It looks like there's no way, without using nuclear weapons, that Israel can change the topic, and I believe they're the ones that would use it, or they would get the president to use it. I don't know exactly what they have on them, but it certainly starts with Epstein, and it makes me feel that we have no control over anything that's going on over there, and we're losing. We've lost to Iran. Today, they opened the borders from the south. The Pakistanis are bringing in cargo trucks of whatever Iran needs. They have a commitment from Russia to support them. We know that China's certainly behind them. They're not going to lose this, and that scares me.
I agree. It scares me too. And I think a lot of people should be scared because the system is very unstable. And the fact that so many experts are openly talking about the use of a nuclear weapon in this conflict is itself diagnostic, because that's something that wouldn't have even been brought up in a serious way, even 5, 10 years ago. But we're clearly seeing how our model of security, rooted in the existence of nuclear weapons and the logic of nuclear deterrence, is coming apart at the seams, and how it can no longer hold the weight of the current geopolitical environment. It needs to be replaced with a new architecture for security. And our argument is that that architecture is only going to be stable if you can eliminate nuclear weapons as a variable in that system, because it cannot be mitigated.
Yeah, remember, they don't even admit that they have nuclear weapons. How can you can't talk to them about it because they don't have them legally.
Yeah. So, I mean, I believe that, the only way that we will eliminate nuclear weapons is if we create an architecture where it is cheaper and safer and more stable to be a part of it than to be outside of it, to actively build the conditions where the incentives for having nuclear weapons are decreased, where their usefulness is decreased, and people or nuclear armed states choose to join, not because they trust us or they trust each other, uh, but because it's in their rational self-interest to do so. And there will always be forces that oppose those steps, even if they are the strategically rational steps to take. And that's why shifting public opinion and making sure that our moral voices are a powerful force to support movement in that direction, are organized and effective in getting us to that new place. There's no guarantee that we will survive this, but also, uh, faith communities have created transformative changes in the world time and time again as they've gotten organized, whether it be um, anti-apartheid, anti-slavery, civil rights movements. There certainly is a strong historical precedent for the power of people when they come together, and the time is ripe for transformation to take place. And I believe we're at one of those tipping points where we need to change.
I would just add a word to that. Thank you, Jenny, because I think it is also really important to remember that we are part of a global community of communities. People around the world are organizing, learning, stepping up, and dealing with the very deep structural and systemic issues that are needing transformation. So I think we also need to hold on to a modicum of hope because the old expression of power to the people is real, and we are claiming that power in a really extraordinary way right now.
Yeah, Art, should I go?
Yes, go ahead, Ron.
Well, first of all, I'd like to publicly agree with what Joe just said in terms of the danger, and also with what Denny's been laying out, that these dynamics do need an entirely new strategic architecture. And paralleling what Karen was laying out, I think another word that's got to be added to that architecture is a new strategic security and development architecture. And so, as soon as you begin designing what the world needs in terms of water projects, power systems, transportation systems, food systems, you kind of open up a multi-trillion-dollar investment that would demand the same kind of infrastructure for production. So if you look at the fact that really the control of the boards that are running all the armaments really come down to a handful of speculators that run the derivatives and have created this entire structure, vastly increasing what Eisenhower warned about, a military industrial complex. So if we actually look at that system, and it's dominated through the central banks like the Federal Reserve in the United States by this old empire, which is really coming to its end. If you look at the global south, if you look at the BRICS, the problem is the manipulation that keeps the United States fighting that as an enemy, as opposed to understanding we should nationalize the Federal Reserve, make it the equivalent of a third national bank or a Lincoln Greenback policy, and issue the credit paralleling those nations for development. And so immediately you create the situation where many of these boards, as we bankrupt this bunch running the finances, and people say, well, these banks are too big to fail. Well, no, if we were on a Hamiltonian system of credit, earmarking credit into things that actually get retired, like physical projects, well, then you can orderly make this shift and hold them in a bankruptcy reorganization. What's legitimate? Pensions, whatever we protect. The gambling debt that's not ours, they eat. If they can get by and fine. But we go back to a credit system based on an American constitutional policy out of Hamilton. So that shift could be done in a piece of or two of emergency legislation. So I'd like to back up the notion that this is not a hopeless situation. The crisis is actually forcing the issue. And so if you look, Russia, China, India to some extent, the global south, and a sane United States policy, I mean, that would open up 1.6 billion productive jobs in the United States. So again, I'd like to, as Karen brought up, this question of an economic policy, but specifically not in the abstract, but in a concrete physical program to start building things like the Oasis Plan in the Middle East, which now has been expanded to go from like the Mediterranean to India, deal with the entire desert situation. So I'll leave it at that as a concept. But I think we're in a much closer situation to ally the forces to get that done, especially with the role the Pope has taken since last October when he cited Cusa and he said his philosophy and his theology was a theology of hope, that the system itself, the created universe, has the hope of mankind that there is a solution, that we have a creative mind to formulate and put together these what seem to be complex oppositions into an effect that would actually solve this. And it's a renaissance building out of this. And you write about the powers in the world to get that done immediately if we break our own ideological kind of blockages and pick up that bigger subject, especially in the 250-year anniversary of our independence from the same group. So I'll leave it at that.
I will say also that in the Back from the Brink resolutions is a provision calling for a just economic transition for the nuclear labor force. A lot of the highly skilled individuals in those industries are precisely the same people that we need to be employed in building a new architecture free of nuclear weapons that can ensure that our monitoring and our verification systems are effective in making sure that countries no longer have incentives to try to break out and develop nuclear weapons. So a world free of nuclear weapons can not only be the right moral position, it can also be a position that creates a lot of jobs and supports the economy.
Yeah, that's where you get the stability to maintain your ideas into the future. You got to build the context. So if we're effective, we're going to have more and more people.
Yes.
You actually need those components being built in the same process.
Are there other questions? Arthur, I'm not sure how much more time we have. This has been really fruitful. I really appreciate this time.
It's almost, I mean, it's a little past 8 o'clock. I think we could go 20 more minutes.
Oh, good.
It depends on what the group wants as well. If the group wants more time or even to meet another time, we have a lot of very, very thought-provoking messages have been expressed this evening. And it may take some time to digest some of this, especially when you were talking about the like a normalized conversation in Congress as well as locally, and how would you see that unfolding
Well, the whole
yourself?
theory of change for Back from the Brink is that we need to build political power in congressional districts across the country in order to give our elected officials in Congress the political space to take bolder directions, bolder positions in the direction of nuclear disarmament. So whenever we pass back from the brink resolutions at city councils, at county councils, in state legislatures, that is providing more and more political space for the member of Congress in that district to support positions, a forward-looking vision towards a new architecture without nuclear weapons. And so fundamentally, our movement is very grassroots. It's about coming together in our communities, like-minded individuals and organizations in coalition, and advocating together at the city level, at the county level, and at the state level, and communicating that shift in public opinion to our elected officials in Congress. So it's not just Congress where we need to be taking actions. It's in our cities and our towns and our counties. And that's actually the most important place because that's what's going to create the shift in thinking and the calculation of our representatives in Congress.
You made a statement that you could help us with this. As I look at Pax Christi, Texas, I see groups in Austin. I see the Pat Delgado groups in El Paso, groups in Houston, small group in San Antonio. We don't have large groups. And so it seems to me like we would have to acknowledge that and work with what we have. And part of that would be, and as I hear this conversation, I think, well, what do we say? What's the rhetoric? What's the message? And apparently you have studied this and you have offered to help us with this. I think maybe it's possible to have some groups join from different, well, Joyce has her group in Dallas and maybe do a little bit of assessment in terms of who do we have and how, what, and if you could speak again to us in terms of, well, what are the very practical steps we could take? Analysis of who we talk to, what we say, how many times we say it. Is there cost involved? How do we go about this?
So, you can certainly use me as a resource. So I am often working with folks in local communities over Zoom, having conversations where we can do an analysis of your local elected officials, the in-district priorities that exist there, messaging suggestions, outreach strategies. I provide my services as a writer because I try to reduce the friction that can sometimes exist between wanting to take grassroots action and actually doing it. So if you have any sort of hesitation about making a phone call to your elected official because you don't know what to say, or sending an email because you don't know what to write, or submitting a letter to the editor because you don't know what to write, I can do that for you. So usually when people make requests, I can get back to them in less than a week with those types of materials. And I want to support you in that way because I want to take some of the burden off of your plate and make sure you know that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to move into action and allow me to support you with materials and suggestions and language. And I'm happy to do that. And I know after this forum, everyone will receive a follow-up email with some useful links and my contact information and sample language for phone calls and emails and letters to the editor. And those are the kind of things I can provide on an ongoing basis and in more tailored, localized contexts as well, individually or with groups locally that want to work together in advocacy on these issues. So you're not alone. You don't have to try to figure this out by yourself. Certainly, the most important thing is just an awareness and a willingness to say, the world that we have today is not the world that it should be. And I want it to be different. And I want to take action. And I want to have the tools and the suggestions and the support. And that's what Back from the Brink is for. And that's what I'm here for. So I hope you will use this as a beginning of our relationship and use me as a resource moving forward.
Well, when it comes down to it, we in Texas don't have, I mean, we have Cooper, I've been involved with, but I mean, we welcome your expertise because I think we really need it. And it's interesting. I'm fascinated by your vocabulary about bridging and filling in the gaps, and it is so true. It's so true. That's what we need. Um,
And
there's some other yeah, Paul Zeiss.
I think one resource that would be helpful for me would be someone to look at the Iran war and what's going on in Ukraine. You know, Ukraine was a nuclear power under the Soviet Union, and they gave up their nuclear weapons to Russia, who has now invaded them, and who is coming to Ukraine to defend them against a nuclear power. You know, we could wonder if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, perhaps Russia would have been less willing to go in and invade them. But I mean, they kind of disarmed, and here they're stuck. And I think we have to ask similar questions about Iran, frankly. We know Israel probably is a nuclear power, although they won't admit it, but you know, generally it's a poorly kept secret. If they do not have access to nuclear weapons, who's going to defend them? I mean, I think these are issues that we have to look at, and I think they complicate what we're trying to do. So if you've got any resources on dealing with Ukraine and Iran and how those are related, that would be helpful for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are resources on the Back from the Brink website that talk about uh, the theory of deterrence and what it proposes to do and what it actually does. Um, I think when it comes to protecting a country from regime change, I think in that very localized dynamic, there's evidence of that. Russia may have thought twice about invading Ukraine if it still had nuclear weapons. Um, Iran is likely to see it as the rational choice to try to pursue nuclear weapons because it's lacking trust in the nuclear armed states and abiding by their commitments under the NPT. Um, it could serve as an impetus for a country like Taiwan to develop nuclear weapons, or Japan, or South Korea, or Turkey. Um, but the problem with that way of thinking is that it's rooted in a logic that if it makes you safer to have nuclear weapons to protect yourself against regime change, then every country should have nuclear weapons. So it just dramatically amps up the danger of nuclear proliferation. And when you have even one more country develop and maintain nuclear weapons, you dramatically increase the risk of catastrophic nuclear war by intent or by accident or by miscalculation. And when that occurs, the consequences of those wars are not limited to the borders of any one country. They affect the entire global community. So we need to be able to think about this not just in terms of a very localized regime change deterrent for a one country, and instead argue about this in terms of a systemic security architecture where it's the best interest of each of us to not create a world where everyone is incentivized to develop a nuclear arsenal because it creates a false sense of security if you're pursuing a pathway that just brings the entire world closer to annihilation based on your logic of security for an individual country. Um, and that's been the case with nuclear weapons in many other ways as well. Nuclear weapons have not stopped war. They have simply changed and distorted the way that war occurs, often in terms of proxy conflicts that allow for projection of power in ways where nuclear armed states attempt to bully their way into positions of influence, knowing that they are not likely to be attacked directly because of their possession of nuclear weapons. But it doesn't stop war. It doesn't stop conflict. It actually increases the likelihood of overseas and international conflict and military adventurism because you have a nuclear arsenal in place. So there's a lot to go unpack with that, but I think there is a clear argument to make why even if you feel like your country is safer from regime change with a nuclear deterrent, it is not in your long-term interest to move in to try to secure your country in that way because it is self-defeating in the long run.
Arthur, could I comment on that and support it?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting that this whole question comes up because France is now working with Poland to increase the nuclear capability. You've got Germany moving to rearm. You got Japan rearming, violating their constitution. So what's going on? Well, I think the thing we have to look at is somebody is running a permanent war policy because their economic colonial system is disintegrating, and the only way they can avoid this collaboration coming together in a new strategic architecture and development is to wreck it. And so we just had a visit from a gentleman, a king, King Charles III, who is part of the monarchy that's been the policy directly against the Russians and every nation state since World War II. And we tolerate this. Congress bounced up and down again today, as they bounced up and down for Netanyahu. If you look at all these things, where did Israel come from? It comes out of a geopolitical structure set up by the British Empire to play that key cornerstone in the Middle East. It links, three continents. So you just destabilize the things. Now, if we move in there with policies that correct that and bankrupt this bunch that's running it, well, all of a sudden the other dynamic opens up. And you're right about this situation. They've played this notion of fear. They play the same thing against the BRICS. If people can stop a second and get back to a human notion that we can work with other humans, we can get the bases to actually pull together the alliances like we're talking here tonight to actually fix it in a relatively quick time if we make and keep it the subject. And the problem is we get pulled off the subject in terms of how do we correct the whole thing. And we got to actually take control of our own credit system in the United States. And we're closer to that than most people know and even think, but that's also what's making it more dangerous because they have to break it up. So, I mean, look at the situation just today with the celebration of the king addressing two houses of Congress. He's over here on the 250th anniversary saying that we're the outgrowth of the Magna Carta and the British Empire in terms of a global force. Well, it's the furthest thing from the truth. And you had Congress genuflecting for that, and you had Bush supporting it and saying the same thing. So we, the citizens, have to come to task here and actually think about this bankruptcy reorganization on the system and not go under with it, but actually determine the credit like Lincoln did, like Roosevelt did. But we could do that through a third national bank or the Federal Reserve. So people should study that. I dropped also a note in the chat which refers this Pope and his mobilization right now, and there's an open letter that's there. We're using as a mobilization to support him and keep it going. And you look at the context of things coming down, attacking him for even saying things that, in terms of God supporting prayers for war. I just saw the Prager University is really quite funny. I'll end with this. Prager University president said he doesn't know what he's talking about because obviously the people, the GIs in the invasion there in Europe, they prayed. You think God didn't listen to their prayers? Well, people can hear that and they say, well, yeah, but we were fighting the Nazis, and today we're actually part of the enforcement of the Nazi policy. So people have to really think through what is actually at stake here, but we also have tools to fix this if we go back to our own history and our own morality. Anyway, that's enough for me.
Did anyone else who hasn't spoken would like to say anything?
Charlene has her hand up. You may not see it because it's up in the icon.
Oh, okay. Charlene. Please go ahead.
Yes, it's a pleasure to have heard you twice in 2 weeks, Danny. So thank you for making yourself so available. My question is slightly in a different direction. I mean, you've told us a lot about what the tactics, the way in which Back in the Brink works with Congress and groups and things. But I'm curious about kind of who do you see as making up the audiences of the grassroots movement? One of the things that we've heard from some of our Pax Christi groups is that they don't get the support that they would like in their churches or with younger people or different audiences who need to hear. I mean, I'm in agreement that everybody needs to hear this information to grow that grassroots movement because we all are being affected, not going to be, are being affected. But I'm just curious from your vantage point, what are you seeing, or what are the talking points, or the ways to bring this very heavy and complicated information to people who are not exposed at the level that those in this group right now are exposed?
I think part of, my job is to try to demystify this work and make it feel like it's more accessible, or help people understand it is possible to step into this. It doesn't, it might seem like a big distant issue, but you already have everything that you need to be successful. The most important thing is your voice and your willingness to take action. The conversations about what to say, the best talking points, that's all stuff that I can assist with, and provide to you. I think the important thing is to speak with conviction at the local level, to be authentic at the local level. Elected officials don't expect you to be experts on the issue. They just expect you to be honest and speak from your values and speak from your experience and tell your story and talk about the local context of why this affects you as a constituent, why this is a local issue that you care about. And I think those are all places where people can feel empowered and can feel comfortable stepping into because they're telling their story. And my job is to provide you support in that process. And if there are, fact sheets or messaging suggestions that would be helpful talking about these resolutions, I'm happy to provide that and make that as easy as possible for folks. But it doesn't take a huge amount of organization. It could start with one person who stands up and says, I want to do something, and scheduling a Zoom call with me so we can have a conversation about what they might be able to do in their city or their town or their county. Or it might be 3 people, or it might be 5 people, or it might be an organization of dozens of people who want to get involved, and they start to have like a monthly, study circle where they have a conversation about this once a month and think about ways that they can work together to take action in their community. There are different ways to scale it up. But there's no level that's too small. It just takes one person deciding that they want to stand up and do something. And I'm here to support, that type of leadership amongst anyone, even if it's just one person.
Joe still has a hand up.
Joe,
Is
is
that for
there
another
your hand
question?
up?
Yes, I wanted to end on something positive. Ron made me remember it. I just read the South China post that the Chinese had just completed a nuclear reactor in a small tropical island south of Hong Kong. And this nuclear reactor, I think, goes online pretty shortly, doesn't radiate, has no damaging radiation. It's made with a thorium reactor. The thorium reactor was something that we sold to China in the 80s. We had it in the 50s, and our military couldn't find a war use for it because it doesn't emit anything dangerous. So now the Chinese have developed it since the 80s, and they're on the biggest nuclear building program in the world right now, and the chances are good we're going to have thorium reactors, and that might change the whole nuclear situation for us in this world. It's very positive.
Does anyone else? Marie, did you have anything else you'd like to share?
No, I don't think so. It was really interesting, Danny. Thank you. It was a great update on the nuclear issue, and I appreciated being with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
everyone.
Good night.
Danny, well, I'll talk to Danny later. But Joe, I'm very interested in the issue of thorium. I've heard about it for a long time. I brought it up the other day at a nuclear meeting, and somebody said that thorium is could be very devastating for the environment. And that's why I'd like to really
Mining of it, is that what he was saying?
possibly that's what they're talking about.
China has a very large mine that they've been mining but they do a lot of rare earth stuff, and it has a lot of thorium in it. That was one of the things I had heard earlier on. But thorium is available all around the world too. So I would only think that would be the environmental negative to it compared with
Plutonium and other things.
and Russia is the other country that builds a lot of nuclear plants. They have all these floating plants all over the world. So if those two go to thorium, it sounds like a wonderful thing to me.
Thorium is not the liquid salt, is it?
No. Liquid salt is, what is that? That's a battery, right? Isn't that one of the new batteries?
No, I think the pebble bed, some of those use a liquid salt coolant.
A coolant? As a coolant, okay. Yeah, this cools automatically, by the way. It doesn't need water or.
I'd like to ask a question and get your input while we're here about how we should respond to Danny at this point. I hear him say one person, 10 people, 20 people. Do you think that there's some possibility to have a board discussion in terms of where we go from here? And I'm wondering too if he does not have some kind of mini workshop on how to pull this together.
Have you all been to Back from the Brink website?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, I invite you to do that. I think it's very navigable and with some really good suggestions. And before we have a meeting, it might be a good idea for folks to really take a deep look at that. Might answer some questions or pose some questions. As soon as I need to start the recording and make sure that we have it and don't lose it. So I'm going to get off and do that if that's okay with you guys.
All right.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Thank you. Appreciate it. Good night.
Okay.
Good night,
Okay.
Ron. Thank you. Thank you, Joe.